400 years is long enough for memory to fade, for promises to seem like distant myths, for hope to become something barely whispered in the dark. 400 years of bondage, of building cities with bricks made from mud and straw, of watching children grow into the same slavery that had broken their parents and grandparents before them. 400 years since Jacob's family had come to Egypt during the famine, 70 souls seeking survival in a land where Joseph, their own brother, risen to power second only to Pharaoh, had stored grain enough to feed the world. 400 years since those desperate migrants had been welcomed, given the fertile land of Goshen, allowed to prosper under the protection of a grateful empire that remembered how Joseph had saved them all from starvation. But memory is a fragile thing, especially in the corridors of power. Generations passed. The dynasty that had honoured Joseph gave way to new rulers who knew nothing of the Hebrew, who had interpreted dreams and administered Egypt's salvation. The text preserves this transition with chilling brevity. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. What had been gratitude became suspicion. What had been welcome became threat. The Hebrews were numerous now, multiplying in Goshen, strong and productive. And the new Pharaoh, looking at this foreign population thriving within his borders, saw not the legacy of salvation but the potential for insurrection. Not guests to be honoured, but a demographic crisis to be managed. So the oppression began, systematic and calculated. The Hebrews were enslaved, their labour conscripted for Pharaoh's building projects, their lives reduced to the relentless rhythm of making bricks and constructing the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Taskmasters were appointed to crush them with forced labour, to break their spirit through exhaustion, to ensure that they were too weary to rebel, too focused on survival to organise resistance. But the policy failed in its primary objective. The more the Hebrews were oppressed, the more they multiplied. Their numbers continued to grow despite the brutality, perhaps because of it, as if the very effort to diminish them strengthened their determination to endure and survive. Then came the darkest decree, the most vicious escalation. Every Hebrew boy born was to be thrown into the Nile. The river that gave Egypt life would become the graveyard of Israel's sons, the systematic drowning of male infants, an attempt to eliminate the Hebrew population through generational genocide. It was into this horror that Moses had been born, hidden for 3 months by parents who refused to surrender their son to Pharaoh's executioners, then placed in a waterproofed basket and set among the reeds of the Nile, not drowned in the river, as Pharaoh commanded, but delivered by the river, into the hands of Pharaoh's own daughter, who drew him from the water and named him accordingly. Moses, drawn out. His life had been divided into 3 distinct 40-year periods, each one shaping him for the purpose he could not yet perceive. The first 40 years were spent in Pharaoh's palace, raised as Egyptian royalty, educated in all the wisdom of Egypt, trained in the arts of leadership and administration, given every advantage that empire and privilege could provide. He was Hebrew by birth, but Egyptian by training, connected to his people's suffering, but separated from it by the walls of the palace, aware of injustice but insulated from its daily brutality. The Book of Acts would later note that Moses was powerful in speech and action, that his education had equipped him with capabilities that went far beyond what a Hebrew slave could normally acquire. He lived in 2 worlds simultaneously, belonging fully to neither. The transition to his second 40-year period came violently and suddenly. Moses, now a man of considerable standing in Egypt, witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Something broke inside him, whether it was rage at injustice, solidarity with his birth people, or simply the eruption of tensions that had been building through years of living divided between 2 identities, the text does not say. But Moses struck down the Egyptian, killed him, and hid his body in the sand. The next day, attempting to mediate between 2 Hebrews who were fighting, he discovered that his act had become known. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The question exposed the failure of his intervention. The Hebrews did not recognize his authority or see him as their deliverer, and the Egyptians would now view him as a murderer and traitor. When Pharaoh heard of it and sought to kill Moses, the prince-turned-fugitive fled into the wilderness of Midian, leaving behind both his Hebrew people and his Egyptian privilege. The second 40 years were spent in obscurity, tending the flocks of Jethro, the Midianite priest, whose daughter Zipporah became Moses' wife. From the grandeur of Pharaoh's palace to the isolation of desert shepherding, from the center of civilization's greatest empire to the margins where nomadic tribes moved their animals across barren landscapes, Moses' life had been radically reduced. These were years of silence, of anonymity, of the slow stripping away of the identity he had constructed in Egypt. The man who had been trained in the wisdom of empire learned instead the rhythms of wilderness survival, the patience required to tend stubborn sheep, the humility that comes from discovering that the skills that made you significant in one context count for nothing in another. He was being prepared, though he did not know it, through the very obscurity and isolation that must have seemed like the death of all potential and purpose. It was during these wilderness years, while Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock near Horeb, the mountain that would later be called Sinai, the mountain of God, that everything changed. He saw a bush burning but not consumed, a sight strange enough to make him turn aside to investigate, and from within the fire came a voice, the voice of the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the voice of the covenant Lord who had been silent for 400 years but who had not forgotten, had not abandoned, had not ceased to see and hear and know the suffering of his people in Egypt. Moses, Moses. The repetition signalled urgency, intimacy, the calling of someone by name who is known and chosen. And Moses' response, "Here I am," was the same response that Abraham had given when God called him to sacrifice Isaac, the same response that would later be given by Samuel when God called him as a boy. The availability that precedes obedience, the acknowledgement of presence that opens the way for commission. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. The ordinary had become extraordinary. The wilderness had become sanctuary. The ground beneath his feet was holy, not because of any inherent quality, but because of the presence of the one who spoke from the fire. Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God, overwhelmed by the collision of the divine and the human, the infinite and the finite, the holy and the common. Then came the threefold declaration that would become the foundation of everything that followed. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. Seen, heard, known. 3 verbs that captured the totality of divine attention to human pain. God was not distant or indifferent or unaware. He had seen 4 centuries of oppression, had heard the cries that rose from the brick pits and labour camps, had known in his very being the suffering that his covenant people were enduring. The silence had not been absence. The delay had not been indifference. God had been watching, listening, knowing, and now he was about to act. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The language of descent was crucial. God was coming down, was entering into the situation, was involving himself directly in the deliverance of his people. And the purpose was not merely negative, not just rescue from oppression, but also positive, bringing them to a promised land, to the inheritance that had been pledged to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to the place where they would become the nation that would bless all nations. Egypt had been the place of survival during famine. It had become the place of slavery. Now it would become the place of exodus, the location they would leave behind as they moved toward the fulfillment of ancient promises. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt. The commission was direct, the task monumental, the implications staggering. Moses, the fugitive who had fled Egypt 40 years earlier, was being sent back to confront the most powerful monarch in the world and demand the release of the entire Hebrew slave population. The God who had come down to deliver his people would work through a human agent, would accomplish divine purposes through the agency of an 80-year-old shepherd who had spent the last half of his life in wilderness obscurity. Moses' response revealed both his self-awareness and his inadequacy. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" The question was reasonable. He was nobody now, a wanted criminal in Egypt, a failed deliverer who had killed an Egyptian and been rejected by his own people, a shepherd with no standing or authority or credibility. Who was he indeed to take on such a task? God's answer reframed the question. "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." The issue was not who Moses was, but who God was. The adequacy was not in the human agent, but in the divine sender. And the sign that they would worship at this very mountain after the deliverance was both promise and proof, assurance that what seemed impossible would be accomplished, that the God who called was the God who would complete. But Moses pressed further, asking the question that revealed his understanding of the challenge ahead. "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" Names mattered in the ancient world. To know someone's name was to have access to their identity, their character, their nature. The Hebrews had known God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as the God who had made covenant promises to their ancestors. But what was his name? By what name could Moses invoke him? How would they address the God who was now acting on their behalf? God's response was both revelation and mystery. "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." The name YHWH, rendered in English as Lord in small capitals, derived from the Hebrew verb to be, capturing something essential about divine self-existence, eternal presence, absolute being. God was not one more deity among the pantheon, not a regional God with limited power and jurisdiction, not a being whose existence depended on anything beyond himself. He was the I Am, the self-existent one, the eternal present tense, the being whose very nature was to be, who needed nothing and lacked nothing, and depended on nothing outside himself. This was the name by which Israel would know their God, the covenant name that would be invoked in worship and prayer, the identity that would distinguish the God of Israel from all the gods of the nations. But Moses was not finished objecting. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, "The Lord did not appear to you"? This was the credibility problem, the challenge of convincing both Israelites and Egyptians that his mission was genuine, that he truly spoke for God, that his demands carried divine authority. In response, God gave Moses 3 signs. His staff would become a serpent and then transform back to a staff when he grasped its tail. His hand would become leprous when placed in his cloak, and then healthy again when removed. Water from the Nile would turn to blood when poured on dry ground. These were not mere tricks or demonstrations of supernatural power, but rather signs that pointed forward to what was coming. The staff that would strike Egypt, the disease that would afflict the Egyptians, the river that would turn to blood in the first plague. Moses was being given a preview, a set of credentials that would validate his mission and foreshadow the judgments that would fall on Egypt. Still Moses resisted. "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Whatever this impediment was, whether a literal speech defect or simply the awareness that 40 years in the wilderness had eroded whatever rhetorical skills he had once possessed as an Egyptian prince, Moses felt fundamentally unsuited for the task of confronting Pharaoh and speaking for God. But the Lord's response cut through the excuse. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. The final objection came in desperation. "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." This was not humility, but refusal, not appropriate caution, but unwillingness to accept the commission. And the text records that the Lord's anger burned against Moses, though even in anger God provided a solution. Aaron, Moses' brother, would serve as his spokesman. Aaron could speak well, was already on his way to meet Moses in the wilderness, and would serve as the voice while Moses provided the words and the authority. The partnership was set. Moses would be as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron would be his prophet, speaking the messages that Moses received from the Lord. So Moses returned to Egypt, the land he had fled 4 decades earlier, carrying the staff of God in his hand, and bringing a message that would shake the foundations of the ancient world's greatest empire. He was 80 years old, no longer the impulsive prince who had killed an Egyptian in rage, no longer the young man who had thought he could deliver Israel through his own power and initiative. He was now an old man whom 40 years in the wilderness had stripped of presumption and self-reliance, whom God had trained through obscurity and isolation, whom divine encounter had commissioned for a task that exceeded all human capacity and that would require constant dependence on the God who had appeared in the burning bush. Aaron met him in the wilderness, and together they went to the elders of Israel, gathering the scattered remnants of leadership that slavery had left intact. Aaron spoke the words that Moses gave him, and Moses performed the signs before the people's eyes. And when they heard that the Lord had seen their misery and heard their cries, when they understood that God was about to act on their behalf, they bowed down and worshipped. 400 years of waiting, of suffering, of watching generation after generation live and die in slavery. All of it was about to end. The God who had been silent was speaking. The God who had seemed absent was returning. The God who had made promises to Abraham was about to fulfill them, and the deliverance would come not through human effort or military might, but through a confrontation between the living God and the powers of Egypt, between YHWH, who declared I am, and Pharaoh, who believed himself divine. The stage was set for the greatest demonstration of divine power in Israel's history, for a series of judgments that would systematically dismantle Egypt's gods and shatter Pharaoh's pride, for a contest that would reveal to all the earth that there was no one like the Lord, no power that could stand against him, no nation or king or pantheon that could resist when he moved to deliver his people. Moses and Aaron, the reluctant prophet and his eloquent brother, were about to stand before the most powerful throne in the world and speak words that would initiate Egypt's descent from empire to ruin, from confidence to terror, from oppression of God's people to desperate pleas for them to leave. A showdown was beginning, a conflict that was never really in doubt but that would require 10 devastating judgments to force Pharaoh to acknowledge what should have been obvious from the first, that the Lord is God, that his word is supreme, that when he says, "Let my people go," resistance is futile and defiance is fatal. The God who had come down to deliver his people was about to demonstrate that his power exceeded every earthly power, that his will would prevail over every human resistance, and that the cries of his suffering people had been heard and would be answered with mighty acts that would echo through history and become the template by which all future acts of divine deliverance would be understood. The palace at Ramesses was the architectural embodiment of divine power made manifest in stone and gold, a structure designed to overwhelm and intimidate, to remind every visitor that they stood before not merely a king but a living God, the son of Ra, the mediator between heaven and earth, the axis upon which the cosmos turned. Pharaoh's throne room was calculated space, every dimension and decoration chosen to communicate absolute authority, to reduce those who entered to appropriate insignificance, to make clear that what the king decreed was law, and that resistance to his will was not merely political rebellion but cosmic disorder, a violation of the divine harmony that his rule maintained. Into this space walked 2 old men, both past 80 years of age, carrying a staff and bearing a message that would have seemed absurd to anyone who understood how empires functioned. Moses and Aaron, the fugitive prince and the Hebrew slave's son, approached the throne where Pharaoh sat surrounded by the symbols and servants of his power. The courtiers and officials who lined the walls represented the vast bureaucracy that administered Egypt's dominance, the scribes who kept the empire's records, the generals who commanded its armies, the priests who maintained the temples of Egypt's gods, the magicians whose knowledge of the secret arts validated Pharaoh's divine status. And before all of them, Moses and Aaron delivered the message they had been commissioned to speak. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. The demand was extraordinary in multiple dimensions. First, it presumed to command rather than petition, to issue orders rather than make requests, to speak with an authority that acknowledged no hierarchy between the God of Hebrew slaves and the divine Pharaoh of Egypt. Second, it required the release of the entire Hebrew labour force, the hundreds of thousands of workers whose sweat and suffering built Egypt's store cities and maintained its economic engine. Third, it was delivered by nobodies, by an elderly shepherd who had fled Egypt as a fugitive decades earlier, and by his brother who had spent his life in the brick pits. By every calculation that power understands, this should have been the moment when Pharaoh's guards seized the presumptuous old men and removed them, when their audacity was punished as an object lesson about what happens to those who forget their place. But Pharaoh's response was not immediate punishment, but rather a question that exposed the theological dimension of the confrontation. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. This was not mere arrogance, though it was certainly arrogant. This was a statement of cosmic order as Egypt understood it. Pharaoh knew the gods of Egypt. He was himself the son of Ra, the sun god who ruled the heavens, whose daily journey across the sky Pharaoh's rule on earth reflected and maintained. He knew Osiris, god of the underworld and resurrection. He knew Isis, the great mother goddess whose magic was supreme. He knew Horus, the falcon god whose eye brought protection and whose power Pharaoh embodied. He knew Thoth and Ptah and Hathor and a vast pantheon of deities whose worship structured Egyptian religion and whose favour sustained Egyptian prosperity. But WH, the god of Hebrew slaves. This was a deity Pharaoh had never encountered, a name that carried no weight in the Egyptian religious system, a god who apparently had allowed his people to be enslaved for 4 centuries without intervening. By what right did such a god issue commands to the divine king of Egypt? By what authority did a deity unknown to the established order presume to disrupt the empire's economy and challenge Pharaoh's decisions? The question, who is the Lord, was not a request for information, but rather a dismissal, a declaration that whatever power this Hebrew god possessed was irrelevant to the concerns of Egypt's throne. Moses and Aaron tried a different approach, softening the demand into something that sounded more like a religious request than a political ultimatum. The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. But Pharaoh was not interested in negotiation or accommodation. His response revealed his understanding of the situation. Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labour? Get back to your work. And then, with the casual cruelty that characterised his entire regime, Pharaoh escalated the oppression. If the Hebrew slaves had time to listen to talk of festivals and wilderness journeys, they clearly were not working hard enough. So he commanded his slave drivers, "You're no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota." The policy was calculated to crush any hope the Hebrews might have developed from Moses and Aaron's message. Now they had to search for straw while maintaining the same production quotas, an impossible demand that resulted in beatings and blame. When the Hebrew foreman went to Pharaoh to protest the injustice, he dismissed them with contempt. "Lazy, that's what you are. Lazy. That is why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks." The foremen, leaving Pharaoh's presence, encountered Moses and Aaron and turned their anger on the would-be deliverers. "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses, faced with this immediate failure, brought his confusion and complaint directly to God. "Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." The prayer was remarkably honest, bordering on accusation. the kind of raw protest that characterized Moses' relationship with God throughout the wilderness years. But God's response did not rebuke the question. Instead, it reaffirmed the promise and revealed the larger purpose. Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. The confrontation was being framed as something far more significant than a dispute over labour policy or a negotiation about religious festivals. This was divine warfare, a contest between Wasatch and the gods of Egypt, a systematic demonstration that would answer Pharaoh's question, "Who is the Lord?" with such overwhelming clarity that no one could doubt. The God who had revealed himself to Moses as I am, the self-existent one who depended on nothing and lacked nothing, was about to prove his supremacy over every power that Egypt worshipped, every deity in whom the empire placed its confidence, every supernatural force that Pharaoh invoked to maintain his divine status. God instructed Moses to return to Pharaoh with a message that made explicit what was at stake. I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. The repeated emphasis on knowing, you will know that I am the Lord, would become the refrain of the plague narrative, the stated purpose behind the judgments that were about to fall. This was not arbitrary display of power or divine tantrum in response to Pharaoh's refusal. This was pedagogical demonstration, revelation through judgment, a systematic unveiling of who God was and what he could do that would teach both Israel and Egypt, both the oppressed and the oppressors, that YHWH alone was Lord, that his power exceeded all rival powers, that his word was supreme. But when Moses delivered this message to the Israelites, they did not listen. The text explains why. Because of their discouragement and harsh labour. 400 years of slavery had ground down their capacity for hope, had taught them that promises were empty, and that survival meant not believing in deliverance, but rather enduring another day. They had briefly worshipped when Moses first came and performed the signs, but Pharaoh's escalation of their oppression had crushed that momentary optimism. Now they could not afford to hope, could not risk the disappointment that would come if this deliverance proved as illusory as every other hope they had ever entertained. Moses returned to Pharaoh, and this time God commanded him to perform a sign to validate his authority. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a serpent. The transformation was deliberate demonstration. The staff that Moses had been carrying since the burning bush encounter was no ordinary walking stick, but rather an instrument of divine power, a symbol that what Moses spoke carried supernatural authority. But Pharaoh was unimpressed. He summoned his wise men, sorcerers and magicians, the practitioners of Egypt's secret arts who served as court advisors and who maintained the supernatural dimension of Pharaoh's rule. These men, whose names the New Testament would preserve as Jannes and Jambres, threw down their staffs, and they also became serpents. The magician's ability to replicate the miracle was significant because it created ambiguity about the source of power. Was Moses' staff-to-serpent transformation unique divine action, or merely another example of the supernatural manipulation that Egypt's magicians routinely practiced? The contest seemed, for a moment, to be even. Hebrew magic against Egyptian magic, Moses' God against Egypt's gods, power against power with no clear superiority on either side. But then came the detail that shifted everything. Aaron's staff swallowed up the magician's staffs. The symbol was unmistakable. The God of Israel was not merely equal to Egypt's supernatural powers, but superior to them, capable of consuming and overwhelming what Egypt's magic produced. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. This hardening of Pharaoh's heart becomes one of the most complex and debated elements of the narrative. The Hebrew text uses 3 different verbs to describe what happens to Pharaoh's heart across the plague sequence. Sometimes the text says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, an active choice, willful resistance, deliberate refusal to submit to what evidence suggested and what wisdom would counsel. Sometimes it says Pharaoh's heart became hard or heavy, a passive description of the condition that developed through repeated resistance, the way that saying no to truth and mercy gradually calcifies the soul until hardness becomes not just choice, but character. And sometimes, most troublingly, it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, divine action that seems to remove free will, that appears to make Pharaoh's resistance inevitable and his punishment unjust. This interplay between divine sovereignty and human responsibility runs throughout the narrative and resists easy resolution. Pharaoh was not a puppet with God pulling strings, forcing him to refuse so that plagues could be justified. The text makes clear that Pharaoh's heart was proud, that his initial refusals were his own choices, that his character was shaped by a lifetime of absolute power and the belief that he was himself divine. But God used Pharaoh's hardness, worked through his resistance, accomplished divine purposes even through, perhaps especially through, the king's stubborn refusal to submit. The result was that Pharaoh became an instrument of his own judgment, each refusal creating opportunity for another demonstration of God's power, each hardening of his heart setting the stage for the next plague, until the accumulated weight of judgment would finally break his pride and force his submission. The pattern that would characterize the plagues began to emerge in this initial confrontation. Moses and Aaron would come to Pharaoh with a demand, "Let my people go." Pharaoh would refuse. God would bring judgment on Egypt. Pharaoh would sometimes acknowledge the plague, sometimes plead for relief, sometimes make promises about releasing the Hebrews. But when the plague was removed, his heart would harden again, the promises would be forgotten, and the cycle would repeat with increased intensity. Each plague would be more devastating than the last. Each judgment would cut deeper into Egypt's security and prosperity. Each demonstration of divine power would be more undeniable than the previous one. Yet Pharaoh would persist in his refusal, would continue to answer, "Who is the Lord?" With his defiance would maintain his resistance even as his kingdom collapsed around him. The magicians of Egypt would play a crucial role in the early plagues, their ability to replicate some of the judgments creating the illusion that Egypt's gods could match Israel's God, that the supernatural contest was more evenly matched than reality suggested. But their power would prove limited, their replication would eventually fail, and they themselves would become victims of the very plagues they claimed to understand and control. The trajectory was already set. The magicians would move from replication to failure, to acknowledgement to silence, their arc from confidence to defeat, paralleling Pharaoh's own journey from arrogant dismissal to desperate pleading. The cosmic dimension of the contest was also becoming clear. This was not merely political negotiation or economic dispute about labour resources. This was warfare between YHWH and the pantheon of Egypt, a systematic assault on the gods in whom Egypt placed its trust. Each plague would target specific deities, would demonstrate the impotence of particular gods, would strip away another layer of Egypt's religious confidence. The Nile, worshipped as a god and considered the source of Egypt's life, would be struck first. Hepa, the god of the Nile's inundation, would be shown powerless to prevent the river's pollution. Heket, the frog goddess of fertility, would see her symbol become a plague rather than a blessing. One by one, the gods would fall, their spheres of influence invaded and overthrown, their inability to protect Egypt made manifest, until Pharaoh himself, supposedly the son of Ra and the embodiment of divine power on earth, would discover that his claimed divinity was fiction, and that the god of Hebrew slaves possessed power that dwarfed anything Egypt's pantheon could muster. But all of this lay ahead, hidden in a future that Moses and Aaron could not yet see, and that Pharaoh could not imagine. For now the confrontation had been initiated, the question had been posed, and the answer had begun to unfold. Pharaoh had asked, "Who is the Lord?" in arrogant dismissal. God was about to answer that question with such overwhelming demonstration that no one, not Pharaoh, not Egypt, not Israel, not the surrounding nations who would hear of what happened, could doubt or forget. The battle lines had been drawn between heaven's king and Egypt's throne, between the self-existent I Am and the self-proclaimed divine monarch, between the God who had come down to deliver his people and the power that had enslaved them. Moses and Aaron left the throne room, returning to the Hebrew quarters to wait for God's next instruction. Pharaoh remained on his throne, secure in his power, confident that his refusal would stand, certain that these old men with their strange demands posed no real threat to his kingdom. The wise men and magicians returned to their arts, satisfied that they had matched Moses' miracle, convinced that Egypt's supernatural power was adequate to any challenge these Hebrew troublemakers might present. The slaves returned to their impossibly increased quotas, cursing Moses and Aaron for making their situation worse, unable to believe that deliverance was coming, too ground down by 4 centuries of bondage to dare hope that the God who had been silent so long was finally about to speak through plagues and signs and wonders that would shake Egypt to its foundations. The God who remembered his covenant was about to demonstrate that he was also the God who executed judgment, who delivered the oppressed and overthrew the oppressor, who answered the cries of his people with mighty acts that would become the defining story of their identity and the template by which they understood all future experiences of slavery and liberation. The 10 plagues were about to begin, and when they were finished, Egypt would know who the Lord was, Israel would know that they belonged to him, and the question that Pharaoh had asked in arrogant ignorance would be answered with such clarity that it would echo through human history as warning to all who would presume to resist the purposes of the Almighty or oppress the people he calls his own. The Lord spoke to Moses with instructions that established the pattern for what was coming. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the water. Confront him on the bank of the Nile, and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. The timing and location were specific, deliberate. Pharaoh's morning journey to the Nile was likely ritual, perhaps part of his religious duties as the divine king who maintained cosmic order, or possibly simply his daily routine. But the choice of the riverbank as the site of confrontation was theologically significant, because what was about to happen would strike at the very heart of Egypt's existence and identity. The Nile was not merely a river to Egypt, it was life itself, the slender green ribbon that cut through the desert and made civilization possible in a land that would otherwise be uninhabitable wasteland. The ancient historian Herodotus would famously call Egypt the gift of the Nile, and the description was accurate. The river's annual flooding deposited the rich silt that made the valley fertile. Its waters provided irrigation for crops and drinking water for people and animals. Its fish fed millions. Its papyrus reeds supplied the material for writing and boat building. Without the Nile, Egypt was nothing. With it, Egypt was a superpower, wealthy and dominant, the breadbasket that fed much of the ancient world. But the Nile was more than an economic resource. It was divine. Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation, was worshipped as the bringer of fertility and abundance. Khnum, the ram-headed creator god, was believed to control the river's flow from sacred caverns. Osiris himself was associated with the Nile's life-giving properties, the cycle of death and rebirth that the river's flooding symbolized. To strike the Nile was to strike Egypt's gods, to demonstrate that the forces Egypt worshipped as divine were actually subject to the God of Israel, powerless to resist when he chose to act. Moses delivered the message to Pharaoh there on the riverbank. "This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water." The warning was explicit, the consequences spelled out, the purpose made clear. This was about knowledge, about answering Pharaoh's question, "Who is the Lord?" with demonstration that could not be dismissed or explained away. Then Moses commanded Aaron, and Aaron raised the staff and struck the water of the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and his officials, and the water was changed to blood. The transformation was comprehensive, affecting not just the main channel but the streams and canals, the ponds and all the reservoirs. Everything in Egypt that contained water from the Nile system turned to blood. The fish died, their bodies floating on the surface and rotting in the Egyptian sun. The river began to stink, the smell of death and decay permeating the cities and villages that lined its banks, and the Egyptians could not drink the water, their very lifeline rendered toxic, their source of life transformed into symbol of death. The magnitude of this first plague was staggering. Imagine the psychological impact. The river that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia, that had never failed them, that their gods supposedly controlled and protected, that river was now poisoned, turned to blood by the word of a Hebrew prophet and the staff of his brother. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. No water for irrigation meant crops could not be tended. No water for drinking meant desperate people digging along the riverbank, hoping to find filtered water seeping through the soil. No fish meant the loss of a primary protein source for millions of people. The smell alone must have been overwhelming, the stench of dead fish and polluted water making life near the river nearly unbearable. Yet Pharaoh was unmoved. He summoned his magicians, and they did the same things by their secret arts. Using water they had presumably gathered before the plague struck, or perhaps from the desperate digging that Egyptians were doing along the riverbank, the magicians turned water to blood. The replication was their defence, their way of suggesting that Moses and Aaron had merely performed a trick that Egyptian wisdom could match, that this was contest of magic rather than demonstration of divine power, that Pharaoh need not submit to demands backed by supernatural effects that Egypt's own practitioners could duplicate. Pharaoh's heart became hard, just as the Lord had said it would. He turned and went into his palace, dismissing the plague, and did not take even this to heart. 7 days passed with the Nile polluted, 7 days of Egypt suffering without their primary water source, 7 days of the smell and the death, and the desperate searching for drinkable water. The number 7 carried symbolic weight, completeness, a full cycle, adequate time for the reality to sink in and for the judgment to make its point. But Pharaoh did not relent, did not acknowledge that perhaps this Hebrew god possessed power his own gods lacked, did not consider that resistance might be futile and costly. His heart remained hard, and the pattern was established. Judgment would come, Egypt would suffer, Pharaoh would refuse to submit, and the cycle would continue with increased intensity. Then the Lord spoke to Moses again. "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs.'" The specificity of the warning was both practical and symbolic. The frogs would invade every space, would penetrate even the most private and sacred areas, would make normal life impossible. The bedroom and the bed suggested no sanctuary from the plague. The ovens and kneading troughs meant that even basic food preparation would be contaminated. Nothing would be safe, nothing clean, nothing free from the plague. Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. The scale was overwhelming, beyond natural occurrence or seasonal variation. Frogs everywhere, in the streets and houses, in the fields and gardens, in the palace rooms and temple courtyards. The text emphasizes the invasion of private spaces. They came up into the palace itself, into Pharaoh's bedroom, onto his bed. The symbol was unmistakable. Pharaoh could not escape this plague, could not insulate himself through his position or his palace walls. The judgment reached even him, even the divine king who supposedly controlled the forces of nature and maintained cosmic order. The irony of the frog plague was particularly pointed because frogs were associated with Heket, the Egyptian goddess of fertility and childbirth, depicted as a frog-headed woman, or sometimes as a frog itself. Heket was supposed to bless Egypt with abundance, with life, with multiplication. But now her symbol had become a plague, had multiplied beyond control, had transformed from blessing to curse. The goddess who should protect Egypt was powerless to prevent her own symbol from overwhelming the land and making life unbearable. This was divine mockery, a demonstration that Egypt's gods were not merely weaker than Wechurch, but were actually part of the problem. Their symbols turned against them, their spheres of influence invaded and perverted. Yet again Pharaoh summoned his magicians, and they also produced frogs by their secret arts. The pattern repeated. Moses and Aaron brought a plague, and Egypt's magicians replicated it. But the replication made things worse rather than better. Egypt did not need more frogs. They had far too many already. What they needed was someone who could remove the frogs, who could reverse the plague rather than add to it. The magicians could imitate but could not deliver, could produce but could not heal, could demonstrate power but could not provide relief. Their ability to replicate was actually exposing their impotence, revealing that their arts could match the symptom but not address the cause, could add to Egypt's suffering but could not end it. This distinction mattered enormously because it revealed the fundamental difference between God's power and human magic. Magic, whether Egyptian or otherwise, operated by manipulating forces and invoking spiritual entities, by working within the created order to produce effects that seemed supernatural. But God's power was of a different order entirely. It was creative rather than manipulative, sovereign rather than invocational, the power that had spoken creation into existence, and that could command its elements to serve divine purposes. The magicians could perform tricks, but they could not control the plagues. They could create problems, but could not solve them. They could match Moses and Aaron in producing signs, but they could not deliver Egypt from judgment. Pharaoh, facing rooms full of frogs and unable to escape them even in his own bedroom, called for Moses and Aaron and made his first concession. "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." This was significant admission. Pharaoh was acknowledging that the Lord had power to remove what Pharaoh's own gods and magicians could not. Was asking Moses to intercede on his behalf. Was promising to release the Hebrews if only the plague would end. But the promise was made under duress, in the midst of unbearable circumstances, and Moses seemed to understand that it would not last once relief came. Moses replied with a challenge that was also an opportunity. "I leave to you the honour of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials, and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile." The choice of timing was a test. Moses was giving Pharaoh the power to determine when the plague would end, demonstrating that this was not natural cycle or random occurrence, but rather direct response to divine command. Pharaoh chose tomorrow. Perhaps he thought a day's delay would show that he was not too desperate, would maintain some dignity in the negotiation. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to ask for immediate relief, could not quite fully acknowledge his need. Moses agreed and then issued a statement that captured the entire purpose of the plagues. "It will be done as you say, so that you may know there is no one like the Lord our God." There it was again, the knowing, the revelation, the pedagogical purpose behind the judgment. The plagues were not capricious displays of divine anger, but rather systematic instruction, a comprehensive answer to Pharaoh's question, "Who is the Lord?" That would leave no room for doubt or confusion. When the frogs died tomorrow at the time Moses specified, when they expired all at once in response to Moses' prayer, rather than gradually dispersing as natural causes would suggest, then Pharaoh would know, or at least he would have been given every opportunity to know, that the Lord was not merely one more God among many, but rather was unique, supreme, without rival or equal. Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked with them. The removal of the living plague created a new problem. The disposal of millions of dead frogs, the stench of their rotting bodies, the work of gathering and burying or burning them. Egypt had asked for relief from the plague, and they got it. But the aftermath was itself a burden, a reminder that sin and judgment leave scars even after the immediate crisis passes, that restoration is not simple return to the way things were, but rather requires dealing with the consequences of what has happened. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. The promise made under pressure evaporated once the pressure was removed. The commitment to release the Hebrews disappeared when the frogs were gone. Pharaoh's word proved worthless, his integrity non-existent, his heart capable of acknowledging need in crisis, but incapable of maintaining submission once relief came. The pattern was fully established now. Plague, promise, relief, refusal. And each cycle would bring more severe judgment, would cut deeper into Egypt's security, would move closer to the ultimate plague that would finally break Pharaoh's pride and force his hand. The third plague came without warning. The Lord instructed Moses to tell Aaron, "Stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats." Aaron did so, and the dust of all the land became gnats on people and animals. The Hebrew word translated as gnats could also mean lice, or some other small biting insect. But whatever the precise identification, the plague was characterized by overwhelming numbers of tiny creatures infesting everyone and everything, crawling on skin, getting into hair and clothing, making rest impossible and cleanliness futile. The choice of dust as the source was theologically significant. Dust of the earth recalled creation, the ground from which Adam had been formed, the basic material from which life came. Now that dust was being turned against Egypt, transformed from the earth that sustained them into swarms that tormented them, the plague demonstrated God's sovereignty over creation itself, his ability to take the most basic elements and transform them according to his purposes, his power to make even the dust serve his will. When the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. This was the turning point, the moment when Egypt's supernatural defences finally and definitively failed. They could turn water to blood and produce frogs, but they could not create gnats from dust. The limitation was not arbitrary, but revealed something about the nature of what was happening. These were not tricks that human wisdom could replicate, but rather acts of creation, demonstrations of the power that belongs only to God, displays of authority over the natural order that no magic could match. The magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." The admission was extraordinary, a confession from the practitioners of Egypt's secret arts, that they had encountered power beyond their ability to comprehend or replicate, that what Moses and Aaron were doing came from divine source rather than from magical technique. The phrase, "finger of God," would recur in Israel's tradition, appearing later when the law was written on stone tablets, by the finger of God, suggesting the direct action of divine power without mediation or instrument. The magicians were acknowledging that they were outmatched, that their arts had reached their limits, that the contest was over and they had lost. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hard and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. Even when his own magicians confessed defeat, even when the experts who validated his supernatural authority admitted they could not match Moses and Aaron, even when the plague demonstrated power that clearly exceeded anything Egypt's gods could provide, even then Pharaoh refused to submit. His hardness was not merely stubbornness, but rather a kind of spiritual blindness, an inability to see what was increasingly obvious, a refusal to acknowledge what evidence clearly demonstrated. The truth was becoming undeniable, but Pharaoh continued to deny it. The power of God was being displayed in progressively clearer ways, but Pharaoh continued to resist. 3 plagues had fallen on Egypt and the pattern was set. The Nile had been struck, turning life to death, demonstrating God's power over the river and its gods. The frogs had overwhelmed the land, showing that Egypt's fertility goddess could not protect Egypt from multiplication turned to plague. The gnats had come from the dust itself, proving that creation obeyed God's command, and that Egypt's magicians were powerless to match his works. Each plague had taught something about who God was. Each judgment had revealed another dimension of divine power. Each demonstration had been designed to answer Pharaoh's question, with increasing clarity. But Pharaoh would not learn, would not see, would not acknowledge. His heart was hard, whether by his own choice or by God's judgment, or by the complex interplay of both. And so the judgments would continue, would escalate, would begin to make distinctions that would separate Egypt from Israel, would move from general demonstrations of power to specific targeting that would protect God's people while devastating their oppressors. The God who had come down to deliver his people was dismantling Egypt's security, stripping away the foundations of their confidence, preparing the ground for the ultimate plague that would finally accomplish what 10 progressive judgments had been designed to achieve: the release of Israel from bondage and the revelation to all the earth that there is no one like the Lord. The fourth plague marked a crucial shift in the nature of the judgments, a transition from universal demonstrations of power to targeted discrimination that would make undeniably clear that these were not natural disasters, but rather divine actions with specific purposes. The Lord spoke to Moses with instructions that introduced a new and ominous element. Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river, and say to him, "This is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies, even the ground will be covered with them. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people." The Hebrew word translated as flies could refer to various kinds of swarming insects, perhaps the common housefly or horseflies, or possibly a mixture of biting insects. Whatever the precise identification, the emphasis was on overwhelming numbers, on invasion of spaces both public and private, on the impossibility of escaping them. But the truly significant element was not the nature of the plague itself, but rather the distinction that would be made. Goshen would be spared. The region where the Hebrews lived, the land that Pharaoh's ancestors had granted to Jacob's family centuries earlier, would be untouched by the swarms that would make the rest of Egypt unbearable. This distinction was theologically crucial because it demonstrated several things simultaneously. First, it proved that the plagues were not natural phenomena occurring through random environmental causes. Natural disasters do not respect ethnic boundaries or observe property lines that separate one people from another. If these had been merely unusual weather patterns or seasonal variations in insect populations, Goshen would have suffered along with the rest of Egypt. The fact that the plague stopped at Goshen's borders proved that divine power was at work, that these judgments were targeted and controlled, that God was executing them with precision. Second, the distinction revealed God's identity as both judge and protector, capable of bringing devastation on his enemies while simultaneously shielding his people from that same devastation. The God who had come down to deliver Israel was demonstrating that he could distinguish between oppressor and oppressed, between those who deserved judgment and those who needed protection, between Egypt, who had enslaved his people, and Israel, whom he was reclaiming as his own. This was not blind fury or indiscriminate destruction, but rather surgical judgment, precisely calibrated to accomplish its purposes. Third, the distinction refuted any Egyptian claim that their gods were protecting them, or that the plagues were simply bad luck that everyone experienced equally. When swarms covered every inch of Egyptian territory, but left Goshen completely untouched, when Egyptian houses were filled with insects while Hebrew houses remained clear, when Egyptians suffered while Hebrews were spared, this created a living demonstration that YHWH was supreme, that he controlled what happened and what did not happen, that geographical proximity meant nothing compared to covenant relationship. The text emphasizes the purpose, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. The knowing theme recurred again, but now with an additional element. God was not merely powerful in some abstract sense, not merely capable of bringing plagues from a distance. He was present in Egypt, was acting within the land itself, was demonstrating his sovereignty in the very territory where Pharaoh claimed divine authority. This was invasion of theological space as much as physical space, a declaration that Egypt belonged not to Pharaoh, or to Egypt's gods, but rather to the God who created all lands and who could act within any territory he chose. The plague came as promised, and swarms of flies filled Pharaoh's palace and the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. The description suggests not just annoyance, but actual devastation, not merely inconvenience, but destruction of normal life and economic function. Flies contaminating food supplies, making food preparation impossible, driving livestock to distraction, making outdoor work unbearable, invading even the most carefully maintained spaces. The association with Khepri, the scarab beetle god who was one of Egypt's most sacred symbols, made the plague particularly pointed. The scarab represented transformation and resurrection, was associated with the sun god Ra, was worn as amulets and carved into monuments throughout Egypt. But now swarming insects, symbols perverted from sacred to profane, overwhelmed the land, and Khepri could do nothing to stop them. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and made his second attempt at negotiation. Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land. This was compromise rather than compliance, an attempt to retain control while appearing to grant the request. If the Hebrews wanted to worship, they could do so within Egypt's borders, under Pharaoh's oversight, without the 3-day journey into the wilderness that Moses had requested. But Moses refused the compromise. That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their sight, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as he commands us. The reasoning was both practical and theological. Practically, the Hebrews' sacrifices would involve animals that Egyptians considered sacred. Cattle associated with Hathor and Apis, rams connected to Khnum, goats that were venerated in various contexts. To sacrifice these animals within Egypt would provoke violent response, would be seen as desecration of what Egyptians held holy. But theologically, the issue was about authority and complete obedience. God had commanded a 3-day journey into the wilderness. To accept Pharaoh's alternative was to let Pharaoh modify God's command, was to treat the king's preference as equal to divine instruction, was to compromise the very principle at stake, that God's word was supreme and that Pharaoh had no authority to alter it. Pharaoh made another concession. I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far. Now pray for me. The negotiation continued, each concession revealing Pharaoh's desperation, while each condition revealed his unwillingness to fully submit. He would let them go, but not far. He acknowledged Moses' access to God, pray for me, but would not acknowledge God's absolute authority over the situation. And Moses, knowing the pattern by now, warned Pharaoh, I am about to leave you and pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only let Pharaoh be sure that he does not act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Moses prayed, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Not a fly remained. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and would not let the people go. The pattern repeated with painful predictability. Plague, negotiation, promise, prayer, relief, refusal. Pharaoh's word was proving consistently worthless, his promises made under pressure, evaporating as soon as pressure was removed, his heart growing harder with each cycle of judgment and relief. He was being given opportunity after opportunity to submit, but each opportunity refused seemed to make the next refusal easier. Each hardening of his heart seemed to calcify further the resistance that would ultimately destroy him and devastate his kingdom. The 5th plague came with a message that escalated the stakes. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys and camels, and on your cattle, sheep and goats. The targeting was now economic in the most direct sense, striking at the animals that provided transportation, agricultural power, food, clothing, wealth. Egypt's economy was built on animal husbandry as much as on agriculture, and the loss of livestock would be catastrophic for individual families and for the national economy. But again came the distinction. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. And the Lord set a specific time. Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. The precision of the timing and the clarity of the distinction removed any ambiguity about cause and effect, any possibility that this was coincidence or natural variation. Tomorrow, not eventually, not in some vague future, but at a specified time, Egyptian livestock would die, while Israelite livestock would be completely untouched. The plague came exactly as promised. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. The text emphasizes the totality of the distinction. Not one. Not most Hebrew livestock spared with a few casualties. Not even one dead animal in all the Hebrew herds and flocks. Complete protection. Absolute distinction. Undeniable demonstration that God was acting with intentionality and precision. Pharaoh sent officials to investigate, to verify whether the report was accurate or exaggerated. They confirmed it. Not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet Pharaoh's heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. This was perhaps the most revealing moment yet of Pharaoh's hardness. He had sent investigators precisely because he wanted to know the truth. The investigators confirmed that indeed, not one Hebrew animal had died, while all Egyptian livestock perished. Pharaoh now had first-hand verification that the distinction was real, that God was protecting Israel while judging Egypt, that the plagues were not random but targeted. And still he refused to submit. Still he would not release the Hebrews. Still his heart remained hard against evidence that should have been overwhelming. The targeting of livestock struck at multiple Egyptian deities. Hathor, the cow goddess, who was one of Egypt's most important deities, associated with love, beauty, music, and motherhood, could not protect the cattle. Apis, the sacred bull worshipped at Memphis as an incarnation of the god Ptah, was powerless to prevent the death of bulls throughout Egypt. Nevis, another sacred bull associated with the sun god Ra, likewise proved impotent. The gods whose symbols were dying by the thousands were being shown to be no gods at all, were being revealed as human constructions rather than divine powers, were being systematically dismantled in a demonstration that only YHWH was truly God. Then came the sixth plague, this time without warning to Pharaoh. The Lord instructed Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. The symbolism was rich. Soot from a furnace, from the very kilns where Hebrew slaves had laboured for generations making bricks for Pharaoh's building projects, from the fires that represented Israel's oppression and suffering. Moses took the soot and tossed it into the air, and it became fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils broke out on people and animals throughout Egypt. The boils were not merely uncomfortable, the Hebrew suggests painful, festering sores, ulcerated lesions that made movement agonizing and rest impossible. This plague struck at the physical bodies of the Egyptians themselves, moved beyond economic impact or environmental disruption to direct assault on human flesh. The pain was personal, immediate, unavoidable, and it struck everyone, from Pharaoh's officials to the poorest labourers, from the priests who served in the temples to the magicians who had claimed to match Moses' power. Indeed, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and on all the Egyptians. This detail is significant because it marked the complete silencing of Egypt's supernatural defenders. They had replicated the first two plagues, had failed at the third and confessed, "This is the finger of God," and now in the sixth plague they themselves became victims, too afflicted to even appear in Pharaoh's presence, unable to offer any counsel or comfort or claim that their gods could match what was happening. The magicians had been progressively marginalized, from replication to failure to confession to silence to suffering, and now they disappeared from the narrative entirely, their arts proven useless, their gods shown to be powerless, their presence no longer even worth mentioning. The boils struck at the Egyptian deities associated with healing and health, Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who could both bring and cure disease, was impotent to prevent the plague. Isis, whose magic was supposed to be supreme, and who was invoked for healing, could do nothing for the suffering Egyptians. Imhotep, the deified architect and physician, whose wisdom was legendary, offered no relief. The gods, whose specialty was precisely the kind of affliction now overwhelming Egypt, were exposed as frauds, as human inventions rather than divine powers, as names and rituals that had no actual authority over disease or health. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. This was the first plague where the text explicitly attributes the hardening to God rather than to Pharaoh himself or to a passive description of the condition of his heart. The progression had been, Pharaoh hardened his own heart, Pharaoh's heart became hard, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The interplay of divine sovereignty and human responsibility reached its most explicit form. The mystery of how God works through human choices while still executing his purposes remained unresolved. But the pattern was clear. Pharaoh's repeated refusals had positioned him to become the instrument of his own judgment, had made his hard heart the means by which God would demonstrate his power and accomplish his purposes. The theme of separation, introduced in the fourth plague, had now dominated 3 consecutive judgments. The flies had swarmed in Egypt, but not in Goshen. The livestock had died throughout Egypt, but not one Hebrew animal perished. The text does not explicitly state that the boils did not affect the Hebrews, but the pattern that had been established and the continuing emphasis on distinction strongly suggests that Israel was again spared while Egypt suffered. The land was being divided, not by political boundaries or geographical features, but by covenant relationship, by belonging to God or opposing him, by being among the people God was delivering or among the nation he was judging. 6 plagues had fallen on Egypt, and the escalation was evident. Water turned to blood, environmental disaster, frogs overwhelming the land, disruption of a normal life, gnats from the dust, inescapable irritation and the magician's defeat, flies swarming, economic devastation and the beginning of distinction, livestock dying, massive economic loss and the clarity of separation, boils afflicting flesh, personal pain and the silencing of Egypt's supernatural defences. Each plague had been more severe than the last, each judgment had cut deeper, each demonstration had revealed more clearly that resistance was futile and that Pharaoh's defiance was bringing ruin on his entire kingdom. Yet Pharaoh would not yield, would not submit, would not release Israel. His hardness had become a kind of blindness, an inability to see what was obvious, a refusal to acknowledge what evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated. Egypt was being systematically destroyed, its water polluted, its land infested, its livestock decimated, its people afflicted with painful sores. The gods in whom Egypt trusted had proven powerless to prevent or reverse the judgments. The magicians who validated Pharaoh's supernatural authority had been defeated and silenced. The distinction between Egypt and Israel demonstrated beyond doubt that these were not natural disasters but divine judgments, not random misfortunes but targeted demonstrations of God's power and purposes. God had revealed himself as both judge of Egypt and protector of Israel, both the one who brings devastation on his enemies and the one who shields his people from that devastation. The land was divided not by visible borders but by the invisible line of covenant relationship, by belonging to God or resisting him. And the judgments would continue, would escalate further, would move from environmental and economic disasters to phenomena that would terrorize the entire nation and demonstrate conclusively that there was no one like the Lord, no power that could rival his, no resistance that could withstand his determination to deliver his people and reveal his glory to all the earth. The 7th plague brought something new and terrifying, a message from God that acknowledged Pharaoh's survival and explained its purpose. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, "Let my people go so that they may worship me, or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. for by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." The statement was remarkable for its transparency about divine intent. God was acknowledging that he could have destroyed Pharaoh and Egypt completely by now, could have ended the contest with a single devastating blow, could have eliminated the opposition rather than engaging in this prolonged sequence of escalating judgments. But Pharaoh's survival was itself part of the plan, was deliberate rather than accidental, was designed to serve a purpose larger than mere deliverance of Israel. God had raised Pharaoh up, whether this meant preserving him through the plagues, or positioning him as Pharaoh in the first place, or both, precisely so that divine power could be displayed and God's name proclaimed throughout the earth. Pharaoh was not just obstacle to be overcome, but instrument through which God would reveal himself to the nations, vessel through which the knowledge of YHWH would spread beyond Israel's borders. This revelation added a dimension to Pharaoh's hardness that made it even more complex. He was resisting God's will, yes, but his resistance was serving God's purposes. He was refusing to submit, yes, but his refusal was creating the conditions for greater demonstration of divine power. He was bringing judgment on himself and his nation, yes, but that judgment was accomplishing something beyond punishment. It was revelation, pedagogy, the means by which God was teaching the entire ancient world who he was and what he could do. Pharaoh's pride was destroying Egypt, but it was also exalting God's name. The hardness that damned the king served the glory of the King of Kings. The warning about this seventh plague was unusually detailed. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die. This was the first plague where a means of protection was offered to Egyptians themselves. Those who feared the Lord's word could bring their slaves and livestock inside and be spared. Those who ignored the warning would suffer the consequences. The text records that some of Pharaoh's officials feared the word of the Lord and hurried to bring their slaves and livestock inside, while others ignored the warning and left their slaves and livestock in the field. This division within Egypt's leadership was significant. Not all Egyptians were responding to the plagues with Pharaoh's stubborn refusal. Some had learned to take God's warning seriously, had begun to acknowledge that the Lord's word was reliable and that resistance was futile. But others, whether from loyalty to Pharaoh or from their own hardness, or from inability to change their worldview, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, continued to act as if the plagues were not divine judgments, but merely unfortunate circumstances that would eventually pass. Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. The description emphasizes the supernatural nature of the storm. This was not normal weather, but rather an assault from heaven, not seasonal variation, but divine judgment. The hail was mixed with fire, with lightning flashing continuously, in ways that exceeded anything Egypt had experienced. The text adds, "It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation." This was unprecedented disaster, something without parallel in Egyptian history, a demonstration of divine power that dwarfed anything that natural forces alone could produce. The hail struck down everything in the fields throughout Egypt: people, animals, plants, trees. The devastation was comprehensive, affecting every Egyptian who had not heeded the warning and taken shelter. The crops were destroyed. Specifically, the text notes that the flax and barley were destroyed because they were in bloom at that time. The wheat and spelt, however, were spared because they ripen later in the season and had not yet come up. This detail was not merely agricultural observation, but rather set up for the next plague, ensuring that Egypt would have something left to lose when the locusts came. The targeting of Egyptian deities was again explicit. Nut, the sky goddess who was depicted as a woman arched over the earth, whose body was the heavens, was powerless to prevent heaven's assault on Egypt. Shu, the god of air and atmosphere, who was supposed to maintain cosmic order and separate sky from earth, could not control the storm. Set, sometimes associated with storms and violence, could not harness this tempest or direct it away from Egypt. The gods whose domains were precisely the atmospheric phenomena that were now devastating Egypt were exposed as impotent, as names without power, as worship without object. The distinction between Egypt and Goshen held. The only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. The separation that had characterized the previous 3 plagues continued with even greater clarity. While thunder shook Egypt and hail destroyed everything in the fields, and fire flashed continuously, Goshen remained calm, its fields untouched, its people and livestock safe, its crops undamaged. The same sky that brought devastation to Egypt brought protection to Israel. The same God who judged the oppressor shielded the oppressed, and the distinction could not have been more visible or more undeniable. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and made what seemed like his most complete confession yet. "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." The admission appeared comprehensive, acknowledging sin, declaring God righteous, admitting that he and his people were guilty, promising immediate release. But Moses, who had seen this pattern before, understood that Pharaoh's words under duress did not reflect genuine repentance or lasting submission. Moses' response was telling, "When I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop and there will be no more hail, so you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord our God." Moses would pray and the plague would end, not because Pharaoh deserved relief, but because God was demonstrating that the earth belonged to him, that he controlled weather and storms, that his sovereignty extended over all natural phenomena. But Moses was not deceived by Pharaoh's confession. He knew that the king's heart had not truly changed, that fear in crisis was not the same as genuine reverence for God, that promises made while hail destroyed the land would evaporate once the storm ceased. Moses left the city and spread out his hands to the Lord, and the thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. The pattern repeated with now familiar predictability, but the language was noteworthy. Pharaoh sinned again by hardening his heart, making explicit that his refusal to release Israel after promising to do so was not merely political calculation, but moral failure. Not just stubbornness, but wickedness. Not simply poor judgment, but actual sin against God. Before the 8th plague began, the Lord spoke to Moses with further explanation of purpose. "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials so that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord." The pedagogy was expanding beyond the immediate participants. These plagues were not just for Pharaoh and the Egyptians who were experiencing them, not just for the Israelites who were being delivered, but for future generations who would hear the story and learn from it. The Exodus would become the defining narrative of Israel's identity, the story that every generation would tell their children, the demonstration of God's power and faithfulness that would shape how Israel understood themselves and their relationship with God for all subsequent history. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh with a message about the next plague. "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. They will fill your houses and those of all your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither your fathers nor your ancestors have ever seen from the day they settled in this land till now." The warning was explicit and terrifying. locusts in numbers beyond anything Egypt had experienced, consuming everything the hail had spared, filling houses as well as fields, bringing devastation so complete that it would become the standard by which future disasters would be measured. But before Pharaoh could respond, his officials broke ranks. They said to Pharaoh, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" This was extraordinary intervention. Pharaoh's own advisers, the officials who served at his pleasure and who had supported his resistance through 7 plagues, were now openly challenging his policy and urging him to submit to Moses' demands. Their question echoed God's own question through Moses. How long? And their assessment was blunt. Egypt is ruined, not will be ruined if Pharaoh continues to refuse, but is ruined. Already devastated, already destroyed, already reduced from superpower to broken nation. The plagues had accomplished what military invasion could not, had brought Egypt to its knees without a single Hebrew soldier taking up arms, had demolished the empire's economy, and shattered its confidence through divine judgment alone. Pharaoh, faced with this rebellion among his own officials, called Moses and Aaron back and attempted yet another compromise. "Go, worship the Lord your God. But tell me who will be going." Moses answered, "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord." This was non-negotiable. Everyone would go, the entire community, all generations, all possessions. There would be no hostages left behind to guarantee return, no partial compliance that would give Pharaoh leverage or control. But Pharaoh rejected this. "The Lord be with you, if I let you go, along with your women and children. Clearly you are bent on evil. No, have only the men go and worship the Lord, since that's what you have been asking for." The sarcasm in Pharaoh's response was evident, invoking the Lord's blessing while refusing the Lord's command, accusing Moses of evil intent while himself breaking promises repeatedly, offering to let only the men go when the entire community's liberation was what God required. Then Moses and Aaron were driven out of Pharaoh's presence. The negotiation ended not with agreement, but with expulsion, not with submission, but with continued defiance. So Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning the wind had brought the locusts, and they invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. The description captured the totality of the devastation. The ground was black with locusts, every surface covered, every plant stripped, every tree bare. What the hail had left, the wheat and spelt, the trees that had survived the storm, any vegetation that had begun to recover, the locusts consumed. Egypt's agricultural economy was now completely destroyed. No crops meant no food for the coming year, no seed for next season's planting, no hope of recovery through normal means. The nation faced not just immediate crisis but multi-year catastrophe, not just temporary disruption, but fundamental collapse of the economic base that sustained the population. The targeting of Egyptian deities continued. Osiris, god of agriculture and the afterlife, whose domain included fertility and growth, could not protect Egypt's fields. Isis, whose magic was supposed to ensure agricultural prosperity, was powerless to stop the consumption. Seth, sometimes viewed as protector of crops, offered no protection. Nepri, the grain god, watched his entire sphere of influence devoured. The gods who should have guaranteed Egypt's food supply had failed utterly, had been shown to be false, had been revealed as human constructions that possessed no actual power over the natural forces they supposedly governed. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more, and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me." The confession was urgent, desperate, but also revealing in its phrasing, "Forgive my sin once more," acknowledging that this was a repeated pattern, that he had made such confessions before, that his track record of promise-breaking was established. The plague was deadly, not because it was killing people directly, but because it was destroying the means of survival, was removing the food that sustained life, was creating conditions where mass starvation became inevitable if the locust remained. Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind, which caught up the locusts and carried them into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left anywhere in Egypt. The reversal was as complete as the plague had been comprehensive. Not a single locust remained. Every insect removed. The invasion ended as suddenly and supernaturally as it had begun. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not let the Israelites go. The pattern continued, the cycle repeated, the judgment was removed and the promise was broken. The relief came and the resistance resumed. 8 plagues had fallen on Egypt, and the nation was indeed ruined. The Nile had been poisoned. Frogs had invaded every space. Gnats had tormented people and animals. Flies had swarmed and destroyed. Livestock had died in massive numbers. Boils had afflicted the population. Hail had devastated the early crops and killed those caught in the fields. Locusts had consumed everything green that remained. Egypt's economy was destroyed, its agricultural base eliminated, its livestock decimated, its people suffering from disease and trauma, its confidence shattered, its gods exposed as powerless. Yet Pharaoh persisted in refusal, continued to harden his heart, maintained his resistance even as his kingdom collapsed around him. His officials had broken ranks, had openly challenged his policy, had acknowledged that Egypt was ruined. But Pharaoh would not submit, would not release Israel, would not acknowledge that the God whose power had been demonstrated 8 times was indeed supreme, and that resistance was futile. The hardness that had been willful choice in the early plagues had become something more like blindness, an inability to see what was obvious, a refusal to acknowledge what evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated. Egypt trembled under the weight of accumulated judgments, but Pharaoh's pride kept him chained in defiance. The nation he ruled had been reduced from superpower to disaster zone, from confident empire to desperate wreckage. And still the judgments were not complete, still 2 plagues remained, still the ultimate demonstration of divine power and the final breaking of Pharaoh's resistance lay ahead. The shaking of Egypt had accomplished what military defeat could not, had brought the proud nation to its knees, had exposed its gods as false, had stripped away every source of confidence and security. But until Pharaoh's heart broke, until the king himself acknowledged defeat, until the oppressor released the oppressed, the judgments would continue their devastating work, each plague a teacher whose lessons were written in suffering and whose test would be passed only by surrender. The 9th plague brought something qualitatively different from all that had preceded it, something that struck not at Egypt's economy or environment, but at the very foundation of Egyptian religion and Pharaoh's claim to divine authority. The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt." The description was ominous in its specificity, not merely absence of light, not simply nighttime extended, but darkness so thick, so oppressive, so tangible that it could be felt, that it had substance and weight, that it pressed down on those who experienced it like a physical burden. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. The duration was significant. 3 days of unrelenting darkness, 3 days without sun or moon or stars, 3 days of blackness so complete that the text says no one could see anyone else or move about. This was not darkness that eyes could adjust to, or that torches could penetrate. This was supernatural darkness, darkness that defeated every human attempt to create light, darkness that made movement impossible and normal life unthinkable, darkness that must have felt like being buried alive or trapped in a tomb, darkness that generated the kind of primordial terror that comes from being unable to see, unable to orient oneself, unable to distinguish friend from threat or safety from danger. The theological targeting of this plague could not have been more direct or devastating. Ra was Egypt's supreme deity, the sun god whose daily journey across the sky was the fundamental ordering principle of Egyptian cosmology and religion. Pharaoh himself claimed to be the son of Ra, his authority derived from his divine parentage, his rule on earth a reflection of Ra's rule in the heavens. The sun's daily rising was proof of cosmic order, evidence that the gods maintained the universe, assurance that chaos had not triumphed over creation. Egyptian religion was built on the cycle of day and night, on Ra's perpetual victory over Apep, the serpent of chaos, on the certainty that the sun would always rise and darkness would always be temporary. But now Ra was defeated. The sun did not rise for 3 days. Or perhaps it did rise, but its light could not penetrate the supernatural darkness that God had brought upon Egypt. Either way, the result was the same. Ra was powerless, impotent, unable to perform his most basic function, unable to bring light and order to Egypt. The God whom Pharaoh claimed as father had abandoned him, or more accurately, had been shown never to have possessed the power Egypt attributed to him. The darkness declared with undeniable clarity that Ra was not God, that the sun was not divine but merely a created object that operated according to the will of the Creator, that Pharaoh's claim to divine sonship was fiction, and that the entire religious system that sustained his authority was built on a false foundation. Other solar deities fell with Ra. Aten, the disk of the sun worshipped especially in certain periods of Egyptian history, was eclipsed. Horus, the falcon god associated with the sky and the sun, was blind or absent or powerless to restore light. Thoth, god of wisdom, and the moon, could not bring lunar illumination to relieve the darkness. Every deity associated with light or sight, or the heavenly bodies, had failed simultaneously, leaving Egypt not just in physical darkness but in theological crisis, not just unable to see, but unable to maintain the religious worldview that had defined Egyptian civilization for millennia. Yet the distinction that had characterized the previous plagues continued with even starker contrast. All the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. While Egypt was plunged into 3 days of tangible darkness, Goshen remained illuminated. The same sky that brought suffocating blackness to the Egyptians brought normal light to the Hebrews. The same God who judged the oppressor protected the oppressed, and the protection was not merely absence of plague but positive provision, not just being spared darkness but being given light. The contrast must have been visible at the borders of Goshen, where Egyptian darkness met Israelite light, where the two realities coexisted in the same land but were utterly separated by covenant relationship, by belonging to God or resisting Him. The psychological and spiritual impact of this darkness is difficult to overstate. For 3 days, Egyptians sat in their homes unable to see, unable to move, unable to work or eat normally or interact with family members in the same house. They could hear but not see each other, could touch but not identify what they were touching, could feel the walls of their homes but could not navigate safely through familiar spaces. The darkness would have been disorienting in the extreme, creating the sensation of being lost even in one's own house, of being isolated even when surrounded by family, of being cut off from human community and divine order simultaneously, and the duration, 3 days, had its own significance. 3 days of darkness echoed the 3 days in the tomb, the period between death and resurrection, the time of complete hopelessness before new life. Egypt was experiencing a kind of death, a descent into chaos, a return to the formlessness and void that preceded creation, when darkness was over the surface of the deep before God said, "Let there be light." This plague was undoing creation, was demonstrating that God could return Egypt to primordial chaos as easily as He had brought cosmos out of chaos at the beginning. It was a glimpse of judgment, preview of what separation from God ultimately means, warning that the light and order that humans take for granted are gifts that can be withdrawn. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and made his final offer, the last negotiation before the relationship completely ruptured. Go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind. This was the closest Pharaoh had come to full compliance. He would let everyone go, the entire population, all generations. But he wanted to keep the livestock, wanted to retain economic hostages that would guarantee Israel's return, wanted to maintain some control over a situation that had proven utterly beyond his control. Moses' response was absolute. You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshipping the Lord our God. Until we get there, we will not know what we are to use to worship the Lord. The refusal was comprehensive, and the reasoning was both practical and theological. They needed the animals for sacrifice. They could not worship God without the means of worship, could not obey divine commands while leaving behind what God required. But Moses also added a detail that shifted the discussion. They did not even know yet what they would need to sacrifice, what God would require, what animals would be necessary. Therefore, everything must go. Not one hoof could be left behind. This demand went beyond the original request for a 3-day journey to worship. Moses was now insisting on complete exodus, total liberation, the removal of every person and every possession from Egyptian control. Whether this represented an evolution in understanding of what God required, or simply the exposure of what had always been the ultimate goal, the effect was the same. No compromise was acceptable. No partial compliance would suffice. No negotiated solution could satisfy divine requirements. It was all or nothing, complete release or continued judgment, surrender or destruction. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Then Pharaoh said to Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." The relationship was shattered, the negotiations terminated, the possibility of further dialogue eliminated. Pharaoh was essentially issuing a death threat, declaring that if Moses appeared before him again, it would be treated as capital offense, that the patience that had allowed Moses to enter the palace repeatedly and make his demands was exhausted. The king was done talking, done negotiating, done enduring the presence of the man who had brought such devastation upon his kingdom. Moses replied, "Just as you say. I will never appear before you again." This was agreement, but also something more. It was prophecy and warning. Moses would not need to appear before Pharaoh again, because what was coming next would bring Pharaoh to Moses, would force the king to seek out the Hebrew leader and beg him to take the people and leave. The confrontation was ending not because Pharaoh had won, but because the time for negotiation was over, because 9 plagues had failed to break Pharaoh's resistance, and one final plague would accomplish what the others could not, because the darkness that had covered Egypt for 3 days was merely prelude to a night of such horror that Pharaoh's pride would finally shatter and his will would break. But before Moses left Pharaoh's presence for the last time, he delivered a message about what was coming. This is what the Lord says: "About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." The warning was explicit and comprehensive. The scope was universal, from the palace to the prison, from the highest to the lowest, from human firstborn to animal firstborn. No one would be spared based on social status or location or any human calculation. The timing was specific. About midnight, the darkest hour, the moment when the day that was ending and the day that was beginning overlapped, the boundary time that belonged neither to day nor to night. The result was predicted with terrible clarity, wailing worse than anything Egypt had experienced, grief beyond measure, loss that would touch every household. And the distinction would be absolute. Not a dog would bark among the Israelites. Not an animal would be disturbed. Not a household would experience loss. Not one Hebrew firstborn would die. The silence of the dogs would be as supernatural as the deaths of the firstborn. In normal circumstances, the kind of catastrophe that killed the firstborn throughout an entire nation would create chaos and noise, would disturb animals and create commotion. But in Israel's territory, there would be peace, calm, protection so complete that even the animals would be undisturbed. The contrast would make undeniable what 9 previous plagues had been demonstrating, that the Lord made a distinction, that he separated between those who belonged to him and those who opposed him, that covenant relationship mattered more than ethnicity or geography or any other human category. Moses concluded his final appearance before Pharaoh with a prophetic description of what would follow. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, "Go, you, and all the people who follow you. After that I will leave." The prophecy was pointed. Pharaoh's own officials, the men who served at his pleasure and who represented his authority, would come to Moses bowing down, would beg him to take the Hebrews and leave, would abandon Pharaoh's position and plead for the departure that Pharaoh had refused to grant. This was prediction of total reversal, of authority inverted, of the king's men going around the king to beg for what the king had refused to allow. And Moses spoke this prophecy in hot anger. The text preserves this detail, showing that Moses was not passive messenger or detached observer, but rather was righteously enraged at Pharaoh's stubbornness, at the unnecessary suffering that pride was causing, at the refusal to submit that was bringing devastation upon guilty and innocent alike. Then Moses left Pharaoh's presence, and the narrative records that the Lord had said to Moses, "Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt." The hardening was serving a purpose. The refusal was creating opportunity. The resistance was making possible demonstrations that would not have occurred if Pharaoh had submitted after the first or second or third plague. 9 plagues had fallen, each one a teacher whose lesson was the same. The Lord is God, there is no other, his power is supreme, his will is irresistible, resistance is futile, and defiance is fatal. But one more lesson remained. One final plague that would exceed all others in severity and impact. One ultimate demonstration that would break Pharaoh's pride and force his surrender and accomplish the deliverance that God had promised when he appeared to Moses in the burning bush. The darkness before the dawn was not just the 3 days when Egypt sat in tangible blackness while Israel dwelt in light. The darkness was also the long night of enslavement that was about to end. The 400 years of oppression that had brought Israel to the edge of extinction, the crushing weight of Pharaoh's refusal that had prolonged their suffering and multiplied Egypt's plagues. But dawn was coming, deliverance was at hand, the night was almost over, and the morning of liberation was about to break over a people who had waited for centuries and who had almost lost the capacity to hope. The night before deliverance would be the darkest night of all, not in terms of literal darkness, but in terms of judgment and grief, and the death that would finally force the release that mercy and warning had failed to accomplish. Egypt, which had experienced 9 devastating plagues, which had seen its river turn to blood, and its land covered with frogs and gnats and flies, which had lost its livestock, and suffered from boils and endured unprecedented hail and locust devastation, and 3 days of darkness. Egypt had not yet experienced the full measure of judgment that refusal to release God's people would ultimately require. The worst was still ahead. The breaking point was still coming. The plague that would finally accomplish what 9 others could not. And Moses, walking away from Pharaoh for the last time, carried with him the knowledge of what midnight would bring, the burden of announcing catastrophe, the weight of watching Pharaoh's hardness bring ruin not just on the king, but on every household in Egypt. The confrontation that had begun with "Let my people go," and had met with "Who is the Lord?" had progressed through 9 demonstrations of divine power, and now it approached its climax in a judgment so severe that it would echo through history, would become the defining moment of Israel's identity, would establish the pattern by which all future acts of divine deliverance would be understood. Judgment's shadow stretched over Egypt, and one more night remained before the morning when Pharaoh would finally learn, through loss so great that even his hard heart would break, who the Lord was and what it meant to resist the purposes of the Almighty. The 10th plague required preparation, unlike any that had preceded it. This judgment would not simply afflict Egypt and pass. It would separate life from death based on a sign, would distinguish between households based on obedience rather than ethnicity, would require active participation rather than passive endurance. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron with detailed instructions that would become the foundation of Israel's most important festival, and would foreshadow the ultimate deliverance that God would accomplish through the sacrifice of his own Son centuries later. On the 10th day of the month, each household was to select a lamb, a year-old male without defect, perfect in form and health. The lamb was to be kept until the 14th day, watched and examined, its perfection verified. Then, at twilight, the entire assembly of Israel was to slaughter their lambs. The blood was to be collected and applied to the doorframe, on the 2 side posts and on the lintel above, forming 3 sides of the doorway but not on the threshold, the blood framing the entrance but never to be trampled underfoot. The lamb itself was to be roasted whole over fire, not boiled, not dismembered before cooking but kept intact. It was to be eaten with bitter herbs, a reminder of the bitter slavery from which they were being delivered, and with bread made without yeast, because there would be no time for dough to rise, no luxury of waiting for the normal process of fermentation. They were to eat dressed for travel, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, ready to leave at a moment's notice. This was not leisurely meal, but rather urgent preparation, not celebration before deliverance, but anticipation during deliverance, eating while poised to flee. And the Lord spoke the words that would become central to Israel's faith and worship. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. The blood was the protection, the covering, the barrier between judgment and mercy. Not the righteousness of the household, not the ethnicity of the occupants, not their participation in the covenant or their record of obedience. None of that would matter when the Lord went through Egypt at midnight. What would matter was the blood, visible on the doorframe, marking that household as under divine protection, signalling that the death angel was to pass over that house and leave its occupants untouched. The Passover, the name itself came from this passing over, this act of divine discrimination that separated the protected from the judged, was to be celebrated annually forever. The Lord commanded that this day would be a memorial, a festival to be observed by all generations, 7 days when bread without yeast would be eaten, when the story would be told to children, when the meaning of the rituals would be explained. It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. The people bowed down and worshipped, and then they did exactly as the Lord commanded. Throughout Goshen, on the 14th day of the month, lambs were slaughtered, blood was applied to doorframes, families gathered for the meal, dressed for departure, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation and dread. They were preparing for deliverance, yes, but the method of that deliverance was sobering. They would be spared because Egypt would suffer. They would live because Egyptian firstborn would die. Their freedom would come through judgment so severe that all of Egypt would be plunged into mourning. Then came midnight. The Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. The scope was universal and the execution was immediate. In one moment throughout the entire land the firstborn died, not from plague or disease that had been building, not from conditions that had been deteriorating, but suddenly, supernaturally, the specific judgment that had been warned and that now fell with terrible precision. Pharaoh rose during the night, and with him all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. The cry that went up was unlike anything the nation had experienced. Every household had lost someone, the firstborn son, the firstborn daughter, the heir, the beloved, the one on whom hopes had been placed, and through whom the family name would continue. From the palace where Pharaoh grieved his own son and heir to the humblest dwelling where parents wept over dead children, the sound of mourning filled the night. Egypt, which had experienced 9 plagues that destroyed their economy and environment and livestock and health, now experienced personal loss that touched every family, grief that was universal and immediate and devastating. The gods who had been targeted throughout the plagues found their ultimate defeat in this final judgment. Min, the god of fertility and procreation, could not protect the children he supposedly blessed. Osiris, god of the dead and the afterlife, could not prevent these deaths or restore these lives. Isis, whose magic was legendary and whose protection was invoked for children, was powerless to save Egypt's firstborn. And Pharaoh himself, who claimed divine authority, and whose firstborn son embodied the succession of divine kingship, discovered that his divinity was fiction, and his heir was as vulnerable as any slave's child. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, going to them, seeking them out, the reversal that Moses had prophesied now occurring exactly as predicted. The king who had threatened Moses with death if he appeared before him again was now desperately seeking Moses' presence, needing what only Moses could provide, and Pharaoh's words were complete capitulation. Up! Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go, and also bless me. The final request, bless me, was extraordinary. Pharaoh was asking the very person he had oppressed, whose people he had enslaved, whose God he had defied, to pronounce divine blessing upon him. The pride that had asked, "Who is the Lord?" had been shattered. The arrogance that had refused 9 times to release Israel had been broken. The king who had claimed divine status was begging a Hebrew prophet for a blessing that only the true God could give. This was total defeat, complete reversal, the overthrow of everything Pharaoh had represented and claimed. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. For otherwise, they said, we will all die. The panic was understandable. If the firstborn could die in one night, what would prevent God from striking again, from bringing death upon all of them if Israel was not released immediately? The Egyptians, who had benefited from Hebrew slavery, who had watched their pharaoh refuse to release the workers who built their cities and served their economy, now desperately wanted the Hebrews gone, feared that continued presence of God's people among them would mean continued judgment. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favourably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. This was not theft, but rather collection of wages long overdue, compensation for 400 years of unpaid labour, recovery of wealth that slavery had transferred from Hebrew hands to Egyptian ownership. The Egyptians, desperate for Israel's departure, and perhaps recognising some obligation for generations of exploitation, gave generously, silver and gold, clothing and valuables, enough that Israel left not as destitute refugees, but as a people of means, carrying with them the resources they would need for the wilderness journey and for building the tabernacle that would house God's presence among them. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock. The numbers were staggering. 600,000 men suggested a total population of perhaps 2 to 3 million, including women and children and the mixed multitude that went with them, people who had witnessed God's judgments and who chose to align themselves with Israel's God and Israel's departure. This was not a small band of refugees, but rather a massive migration, a nation on the move, carrying with them their children and their elderly, their flocks and their herds, everything they owned and everything the Egyptians had given them. The theological significance of the Passover extended far beyond the immediate deliverance from Egypt. The lamb that was sacrificed, the blood that was applied to the doorframe, the death that passed over those covered by blood. All of this pointed forward to greater realities, to the Lamb of God who would take away the sin of the world, to the blood of Christ that would provide eternal covering for all who trusted in him, to the death that Jesus would die so that those marked by his blood might pass from death to life. The requirement that the lamb be without defect prefigured Christ's sinlessness, his perfect righteousness that qualified him to be acceptable sacrifice. The instruction that no bone of the lamb was to be broken would be fulfilled when Jesus hung on the cross, and the soldiers, finding him already dead, did not break his legs as they did for the criminals crucified beside him. The timing of the Passover sacrifice, at twilight, at the hour when Jesus died, created direct parallel between the deliverance from Egypt and the deliverance from sin. The bread without yeast, which Paul would later explain represented sincerity and truth, the removal of the old leaven of malice and wickedness, became part of Christian communion, the breaking of bread in remembrance of Christ's broken body. When future generations asked the meaning of the Passover ceremony, parents were to respond, "It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians." The story would be told and retold, each generation learning that their deliverance from Egypt came not through their own power or merit, but through divine judgment on their oppressors and divine protection through the blood. And when John the Baptist saw Jesus coming toward him, he declared, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world," identifying Jesus as the fulfillment of what the Passover lamb had always pointed toward. The ultimate sacrifice whose blood would provide not just temporal deliverance from earthly slavery, but eternal deliverance from sin and death. The 10 plagues had accomplished their purpose completely. They had answered Pharaoh's question, "Who is the Lord?" with overwhelming demonstration that which alone was God, that he possessed power that eclipsed all rival powers, that his sovereignty extended over all creation, and that his will was irresistible. They had systematically dismantled Egypt's pantheon, striking at each god in turn, proving their impotence and revealing their falsehood. They had distinguished between Egypt and Israel, showing that God protected his covenant people even while judging their oppressors. They had broken Pharaoh's pride and forced his surrender, accomplishing through divine judgment what negotiation and warning had failed to achieve. But more than demonstrating power or securing release, the plagues had revealed God's character, his justice in judging oppression, his faithfulness in keeping covenant promises, his mercy in providing protection for his people, his patience in giving Pharaoh repeated opportunities to submit, his sovereignty in using even human resistance to accomplish divine purposes. The story would become definitive for Israel's self-understanding, the lens through which they interpreted all subsequent experiences of bondage and liberation. The proof that their God was not merely tribal deity, but rather Lord of all the earth who could act within any nation and overthrow any power that opposed his purposes. And the shadow of these events stretched forward across centuries, finding ultimate fulfillment when another lamb would be sacrificed, when another blood would be applied not to wooden door frames, but to human hearts, when another midnight would bring death to the firstborn, God's own firstborn son, so that those covered by his blood might pass from death to life, from bondage to freedom, from Egypt to the promised land, from sin to righteousness, from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. The 10 plagues that shook Egypt and delivered Israel became the pattern and prophecy of the greater deliverance that would shake the cosmos and deliver humanity. The judgment on Egypt that pointed toward judgment on sin. The Passover lamb that foreshadowed the Lamb of God. The exodus from slavery that prefigured the exodus from death that Christ would accomplish through his own blood and his own resurrection. From Ramesses to Sukkoth, from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to Sinai, from Passover to Pentecost, from the Red Sea crossing to the inheritance of the promised land, the journey had begun. And at every step, the lessons of the plagues would echo, that God delivers the oppressed, that he judges the oppressor, that his power is supreme, that his promises are sure, and that the blood of the Lamb makes all the difference between death and life, between judgment and mercy, between remaining in bondage and walking in freedom. Egypt had trembled before God, had learned who the Lord was through 10 devastating judgments, had released the people they had enslaved for 4 centuries, and the God who had come down to deliver his people had accomplished everything he promised, had proven himself faithful and powerful and worthy of worship, and had begun to form this mass of freed slaves into a nation that would carry his name and proclaim his glory to all the earth.